I've been making my artwork traditionally for the last 2 decades, and whether it's for comics, posters, or advertising work, getting the tones, shadows, and highlights just right in those illustrations is the key to making that artwork look good. And if you're also into hand-painted retro-style fantasy, sci-fi, and comic book art, then you're in the right place. I'm going to show you how I use traditional illustration techniques to make cool-looking art. Let me show you what I mean with this illustration I made earlier this week. This was just a fun idea I had with an original character of mine that will feature in an upcoming webcomic I'm developing. It's got vampires, werewolves, zombies, and other horrific creations that I love to draw. But this video will demonstrate just how easily you can hand colour your characters with just a few colours and in a few minutes. That's going to save you time on your illustrations, but you're still going to have great looking artwork in the end. So I start by completely covering my canvas with colour. Eliminating any white of the page makes the painting process less daunting, as I can decide how much contrast the elements will need depending on where they sit against the background. In this case, I want to create a contrast between my background and characters so they'll have a darker tone and stand out against the deep orange glow. Using a mixture of blue and cool grey acrylic ink creates a chromatic green that I use to completely block in the shape of the character. By covering the area to paint, it's far easier to work out where the shadows and highlights need to go. It also acts as a really nice base tone for her skin. She's a bat monster lady who controls a horde of skeletons. She's also very old, and I want to emphasise that in her skin tone and texture. The skin needs to have a leathery look to it, and to also add to the horror, she's got a bit of a green shade to her. She doesn't need to have perfect skin, but you know what, she doesn't look bad for her age. Now I use a lightbox to shine light through my image, and that shows me exactly where all my outlines are, so I don't have to worry that my blocking in is covering up any important details. I can just focus on getting a good solid block in of colour over the figure. Using acrylic ink for the painting process gives me a great wash effect if watered down, but I can use it undiluted to create more of an opaque look. It also doesn't affect the surface texture once it's dried, as it absorbs into the surface rather than sitting on the top of the surface, leaving that surface roughness that we can utilise when adding pigment with pencil. If I just used acrylic paint, that would dry too thick and leave a very smooth plastic finish that would be hard to colour with pencils, as we'll start to do in the next step. For my work, I like to use the Polychromos colour pencils by Faber-Castell. They are water resistant, so we're not going to see any blending of the pigments if I need to correct any mistakes by going over it with acrylic ink. The hard leads also allow me to get a finer point than I would with most softer leads, which is great for really small details. I'm starting with just 2 colours for the skin tones, working a cream colour over the areas of skin that I want to be the lightest, leaving areas that will be in shadow. For those darker areas, I'll go over them with an earth green colour. It gives her skin a nice transition from the lighter areas to those in shadow. It's important to switch the lightbox off from time to time because the colouring process is building up the value of colour, and it's not as easy to see how that looks with the lightbox on. Where the lightbox comes into play is as it guides where to add those highlights and shadows, but it can inhibit your vision as to how much you need to apply, so be careful. I'll continuously switch it on and off throughout the colouring process to make sure the shadows and highlights are placed properly, but the intensity of each is balancing out just right. This drawing of the character's head isn't very big, about half the size of my thumb, and we have to imagine that if this piece were a comic book cover, that size would probably reduce by half again. It's always a good idea to create the original illustration larger than the final print, so you get that tightening up of all the details in the final print. So adding in too much detail can overcomplicate the image and what we're trying to achieve. For areas around the shadow, I'll use a little bit of Indian red pigment, as though the skin were picking up subtle reflections of the surrounding colour. This occurs with any skin tone. You'll have slight reflections in the skin, especially the smoother the skin or any surface. And it just adds to the believability of the piece, making our characters interact with the surrounding environment. I'll keep the dress black to create a striking contrast against the lighter background, and also helps to frame our main character in the foreground. After lightly outlining the edges of her wings with the Indian red, I can work into the actual wing with some of that same earth green around the edges. I looked at some bat wings as a reference and paid close attention to the thickening of the wings towards the limbs. And I'll try and emulate that here by allowing the background light to shine through the thinner part of the membrane. But you can also see the silhouette of some of her skeleton army in the background just shuffling along in the background behind her, all adding to the sense that there are more of them than we actually have to draw. The deeper orange over the middle of the membrane gives the illusion that there is something there, but transparent enough that we can see a soft shape moving around behind her. Now, I'm not really satisfied with how dark the dress is at this point. I think we can go darker. And isn't the little black dress supposed to be for every occasion anyway? So using some black acrylic ink, I can go over the area where the dress would be and any other areas I want to really emphasize the shadows. After a light spray of yellow with the airbrush, I'll add these bright highlights with a mixture of white and yellow in acrylic ink. This not only emulates the light being picked up by the character's face from behind, but it creates the illusion of structure to the face. And it also creates a subtle focal point for our eye to follow as we see our main character's eye line moves us to look over his shoulder and towards the face of the Bat Lady behind him. It really is fun to explore these techniques of light and shadow and how you can create interesting compositions that tell a story. You're actually able to dictate to the viewer where you want them to look, depending on how intense or soft your shadows and highlights are. You can hide elements in shadows and emphasize others with light. Composition, anatomy and style are key elements to any illustration. But really amazing colour, shading and lighting techniques can elevate an illustration from dull to phenomenal. If you would like to see some more of this character, why not let me know in the comments? What dangerous situation would you like to see him in next? I'll make it and explain how I did it. I have a few crazy ideas I'm cooking up to explore in a webcomic which I'll leave a link to below for anyone who likes horror with a 70s funky twist. I'll be back with some more lessons soon. Thanks for watching.